Hello, IHHs. I am dropping into your downloads to present you with an interview. So this has come up as part of the research that I'm doing for another case. Unfortunately, that research has taken me down a much longer path than I was anticipating. I'm looking into quite a few different spheres, and so the story is taking longer to get from me to you. But I did do this very interesting interview as part of that because the case revolves around extreme violence perpetrated against someone who was involved in the sex work industry. And I went to Sweat and Sisonke, and I'll explain what those are in a second, to talk about some of the violence that sex workers face and the work that is trying to change the narrative around sex work so that we can afford sex workers more protections. This is an interview with Yonela Sinqu, who is the communications officer at Sisonke National Sex Workers Movement in South Africa. It's in the format of quite a relaxed conversation between Yonela and I because that is my preferred interviewing style. So there is a bit of back and forth. And Yonela was recording in quite a noisy office. So I'm afraid that the sound quality isn't spectacular. But I think that what she has to say is so important to hear. Now, I know that there will be some people listening who are disgusted by the idea of sex workers. My own personal beliefs, as I've stated a couple of times, is that sex work is work and sex workers deserve all of the protections and human rights that any of us who aren't sex workers enjoy. But if you are not of that ilk, I still encourage you to try listen to this interview with an open mind. I think that Yonela does an excellent job explaining some of the dynamics of the sex work industry that you and I might not be familiar with. And it's an opportunity to learn and to be kinder to each other, which is always something that I want to get into. Before we start, I want to remind you that according to a very recent study from the South African Medical Research Council, 71% of female sex workers have reported that they have been exposed to physical violence, and 58% said that they had been raped. 1 in 7 of these women reported being raped by a policeman. Right, so with that background, I am going to drop you straight into the conversation between myself and Yonela. Have a listen. Let me know what you think.
Thanks for having me.
Oh gosh, I'm so glad that you could participate. You know, I'm new to podcasting, but my background is as a journalist. So as much as possible, I want to include primary sources.
That's great. I'm so honored because, you are helping us change the narrative. The more we talk about things, the better.
I have a couple of questions prepared. One of the things I did want to ask about up front is I'm familiar with the name Sweat, but not Sisonke. And I was wondering if you could tell me about the relationship there.
Sisonke is the National Sex Workers Movement, which was born out of Sweat. So what's the difference between the two, as much as they work very parallel, is that Sisonke is not a service provider, unlike Sweat. So what Sweat does, they will do the testing, like almost basic healthcare service provision. And that is something that Sisonke does not do. Sisonke is more of a movement than a service provider to sex workers. I would liken Sisonke to a union of sex workers. If we were a formalized sector within the labor sector, Sisonke would be the union representative of sex workers.
That's an excellent analogy. Now I understand. If you could wave a wand and literally create law tomorrow, what would be the outcome that you are advocating for?
As Sisonke and the rest of the sex workers, what we are looking for is the decriminalisation of sex work, not legalization, because legalization comes with a lot of terms and conditions which are very much similar to criminalization. So I would say legalization is half decriminalization. It's half criminalization. The reason why I say half criminalization is If you are legalized, that means government still has a lot of control over what happens. For instance, they could say, okay, we are legalizing sex work today. That means only in certain areas can you operate. You will operate under certain terms, which are still set out by government. So if they say, because you're living in South Africa, we will only allow sex work in Cape Town. So then what happens to the other 8 provinces? And that will be, and then they would say, but we gave you legalization. What more do you want? But with decriminalisation, that means, yes, you are free to operate at your terms where you want to operate. However, you are still guided by law. And I mean, we cannot have a lawless country, but we need laws that are not going to infringe upon the rights of people. Because currently with criminalization, that is infringing upon economic freedom. That is infringing upon our freedom to choice. That is also infringing on justice. Because if a sex worker is raped, for instance, they cannot go and fully declare that I was raped during work. But if we were to be decriminalized, we could get full access to justice. We could get full access to economic freedom. Also with legalization, there could be a clause that says, okay, you are legalized, say 60% of your earnings go to tax. However, if you are decriminalized, you would operate based on the lands or the country's labor law systems. That is what would guide you. So they cannot just say, okay, because you're a sex worker, we're going to take 60% of your earnings.
It makes sense. It also leaves people open to organize themselves to work in their preferred way. So I'm a freelancer, for example. I don't have to work with anyone. I could, however, go join up with another freelancer and start a little business. I'm allowed to do that in my line of work, whereas sex workers don't have those options.
No, you don't. With sex work, it's almost like survival of the fittest in the underground world. And you sort of don't exist until you have to be arrested.
Yes. Yeah.
And also with criminalization, there's so much gray areas because there are a lot of sex workers who get arrested and detained, but their cases never go to court because one, it is the act that is criminalized. But now when they come to arrest, so when it comes to justice and SAPS, these are 2 different departments who are interpreting the whole criminalization of sex work very differently. And then you find that in the process, there's a lot of abuse taking place, which sex workers see no justice for. Because if they detain you and they keep you, and then you don't get to be charged, and then you're suddenly released. So that is, then the police become a nuisance towards sex workers. But however, sex workers cannot go back and sue for the inconvenience.
Yeah.
And for loss of income.
There's almost a double set of abuses then on the police side, because they've got that sort of systemic abuse of keeping you from justice, of detaining you without trial, etc. But we also know that policemen perpetrate a lot of direct violence against sex workers.
Very true. And when those happen, the sex workers are unable to report such because, I mean, this is the same person who violated you. Now you're going to go and report that same violation to the same person who violated you. Because, I mean, as much as they say IPRID is there, but we know nothing gets done. Nothing. They're protecting each other. And when then it comes out that you are a sex worker, and this was, you almost you now facing double the stigma, and you are treated as subhuman, as if whatever happened to you was right. So that person had the right to violate you, and you're no longer a citizen of the country.
It's really shocking. You can see it in the coverage of the Siam Lee case. When the news first broke, all the news was, shame, this pretty teenager has been taken. And quite soon after that, it emerged that she and her mom were both involved in sex work. And the media narrative around the case turned into one, it sort of suggested, I saw one quote that was like, well, it's a very murky world, as if to say, what you're going to do, it's her fault.
Yeah. And also, just to add to that, when it comes to sex workers and crime, sex workers are often the scapegoat, as I can put it, to all criminal activities that take place in our society. However, if we look at it, there's always conflated ideas that sex workers encourage human trafficking. But if we look at it, it's not the sex workers that traffic the people. They fall victim into such. And we don't consider that as sex work. We consider that as sex slavery, because sex work is someone who is an adult, first of all, who is consenting to what they are doing, and they choose that line of work for themselves. So if I were to capture two little girls and say, okay, now you're sex workers, those girls are not sex workers. It's not sex work and the sex work industry that should be blamed for such an action. The individual doing that should be the one that is brought to book for encouraging slavery and for abusing people and for violating someone's rights. So you become the scapegoat for every social ill in our society.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the wording has nice parallels with, we used to use the term child pornography. But if you strip that back, what you're seeing is filmed or photographed abuse. That's not something that a child can willingly participate in. This is not child porn. This is rape.
Exactly. And it's never in the sex work, and we look at the sex work industry from a needle's hole, which is very small, because the sex work is very broad. If you look at strippers, they form part of the sex work industry. And if we look at pornography, that is porn stars, porn makers, they fall within the sex work industry. And I'm gonna use this in block codes. What people often say prostitution, and then they look at that sector, the people that are now doing the transactional sex, and they say that, but you guys are the filth. You guys deserve to be criminalized. But this is a whole big industry, and everyone is affected by everything that is happening within this industry.
Do you have a sense of how something like X-rated content on OnlyFans would that fall under sex work to your mind?
It does fall under sex work, because sex work is not only limited to having sex and paying for the sex, but now because of the laws within our country, it has created a divide within the industry. Because if you look at the health industry, for instance, not everyone is a doctor within health, and not everyone is a clinician under health. We get cleaners that are working within health. We get the various doctors within health, that is, be it psychiatrists, be it physicians and everything. And so the same happens in sex work, but because this is always termed an industry with uneducated black women who are trash, druggies and alcoholic. And that narrative and that stigma and stereotype has lived on for so long that the people now who went into stripping and to porn and X-rated content have now de-associated with themselves with sex work, because a sex work is a very broad term, and which a lot of people have just narrowed it down to this particular group. But if you in fact look at it, it's all adult entertainment, as I would term it.
Yeah, it's interesting now, because you kind of wonder where, if you were providing X-rated content on OnlyFans, where would you fall within the South African law? Because that means that a lot of the policing of sex work is being directed at perhaps the most vulnerable of sex workers, who are on the street by themselves, just by virtue of the privilege now accorded to someone who's doing a very similar job digitally.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at it, this section of the industry, which is X-rated content production and stripping in a club, that is permissible. But the most vulnerable and most accessible people, and who are also the least earners, if I were also to put it that way, because these people negotiate at the lowest rate compared to the other two. And they are the ones that are most violated and most abused
because they are easily available targets to our law system. And that is a barrier that we are looking at breaking and saying that because you are depriving someone of making an income and you are depriving someone of their right to access to justice, and you are depriving their right to healthcare.
I was wondering what the police are able to do to clients of sex workers in this country.
Based on what our constitution says and our law, the client and the service provider should be criminalized. However, it's never easy to catch the client because you don't know who the client is, and the client normally would sue for invasion of privacy. The service provider is the one that is out on the street, who is visible to everyone, and that becomes the target.
Siam and her mum were described in the media as living and working in a brothel. I was wondering what your take on that term is, brothel.
Brothel for me is not a very good term. It's a very demeaning term. You see, it's just like the word prostitution, where someone will call the next a prostitute. Both those terms are very demeaning, and they carry so much stigma and so much hatred, which fuels a lot of hate crimes against the people that are living in these homes and that are making business in these places. And most of the time, the minute that people utter such words, it is normally followed with so much hate and disgust that people just don't want to be associated with it. It's almost so much filth that you don't even want to talk about it. It's such taboo in our society, and it's termed immoral.
But then again, what is more immoral, to be poor and not have a loaf of bread, or to go out and make means for yourself?
What do you think the effect of the association or perception of the word sex work would have had on police handling a case where a woman who happens to be a sex worker is abducted?
Everything is when it comes to sex work is always handled with such attitude, and this time around it's always such a negative attitude, because a lot of people have stigmatized the industry so much, and it has dehumanized the whole industry. It literally makes it a case of murder against a sex worker nothing. It's almost a thing of, so why should we feel sorry for her? She got what she deserved. Kind of insensitive attitude that one gets from the police, even our community at large. You literally change from being a woman into a so what kind of case.
How do we begin to change that narrative in society? And how can people who aren't involved in sex work be useful in changing that and advocating for sex workers?
First and foremost, I want to thank you and people like yourself who find it in their time of day and in their work to say, you know what, let me get a sex worker, let me go and talk to someone who knows what is happening within the industry. Because a lot of times, a lot of people look at sex work and think, shame, poor souls, they need to be rescued, they need to get out of what they are doing, forgetting that these are adults. These are people who sat down and thought, okay, now this is what I want to do. As much as you sat and said, you know what, I want to be a journalist, or I want to be a lawyer, or I want to be something else. Someone sat and said, I want to engage in sex work because it offers me economic freedom. It's an industry that I do not need a certain degree, which maybe I could not be afforded, or it affords me the flexibility of doing what I want to do in my extra time when I'm not doing my journalism work or my law work. First of all, we need to change the way our perception of looking at things and saying, shame, poor souls. We start recognizing this as work. We start respecting it as work and saying, that is someone who is at work. That is someone who is putting food on their table without having to rely on government and hand-me-downs. So the minute people start understanding and recognizing sex work as work, I think we would have moved 2 steps forward into progression.
Critics often say that sex work is inherently gender-based violence, or that all porn is violent. What is your take on that?
First and foremost, that
When with other work that you do, you can choose to say no. The common denominator is that you are rendering a service and you're getting paid for it. So if you do not want to render a certain service to a certain person prior to going into the deal, you can always say no. I do not do X, Y, and Z, and be prepared to walk out of it. And now, because no one wants to talk about it, you find that there is no written contract or there is no written agreement on it. So it's often very difficult to walk out of it because it fuels that kind of upper hand from the client that, listen, I paid you. They know very well that you cannot go and say, I'm laying a charge against this person because this was the agreement, because everything is done verbally. So you cannot prove that said, no, this was not the agreement. And that's when the violence kicks in. Or it's not sex work that is violent, or it's the sex worker. It's often the client who feels they have the upper hand, hence victimizing the sex work. So saying that it's a violent industry,
it's a very much unfair statement, because it's the people coming into the industry that make it violent towards the service providers.
What services would you like to see provided to the sex work industry?
Most importantly is mental health. Because if we look at the atrocities that sex workers have to go through, that is traumatic just by thinking about it. And then you've got nowhere to go. When you're trying to seek recourse, you are further violated and abused. So the traumas that sex workers go through is inexplicable. I mean, no one deserves the amount of trauma that sex workers are put through by their clients and by society and by our justice system. And healthcare is so expensive, but it's so important, because if your mental state is not functioning well, you as a person cannot function well, and then hence you find that people go into drug dependency, they go into substance dependency. Mental health is, for me, very important, and that is the biggest service which we need within the sex work industry. If you were to be a rape victim, you need the social support. And now to be termed that it's your fault, that is again victimizing you. That is often what sex workers have to go through, and society just does it so willingly.
And do you find that sex workers face extra discrimination when they seek help? You know, what is the reaction that people get?
The minute that you, regardless of where you go, whether you're trying to open a bank account or you're trying to go into get help and at a clinic or wherever, the minute that the person who is assisting you finds out that you're a sex worker, it's discrimination. In a lot of time, it's you're always termed as the disease spreader. You are always termed as the unacceptable one. Like, be careful, she's a sex worker, she's gonna spread HIV. But in all honesty, how many HIV positive people are there that had no dealings with sex workers? For instance, if you look in rural areas, you don't normally find sex workers in rural areas, but you find people who are HIV positive there. So how do they get HIV? If then sex work is now the biggest spreader of diseases. And you find that a lot of sex workers advocate for condom use, whereas in most intimate partner relationships, condom use is just something that is not even negotiable. It's almost in most intimate partner relationships, you'll find that people say they don't use condoms because their partners see it as a distrust. So if you got trust issues, you would use a condom. And you'll find that a lot of sex workers who negotiate for condom use as well from their clients, they literally beg their clients to use a condom, not because they are HIV positive, but they're also looking out for everyone's health. You find that they now have to suffer abuse of why do you got diseases, and then you start getting the beat, because that is something that someone is used to at home. That's what they do at home. And when they come within the industry seeking a service from a service provider who's a sex worker, they expect the same behavior and mentality applies here. And you find that in most cases, it's married men that come to sex workers, but you find that the other partner is always blaming the sex worker for luring their partner into doing immoral things. When you come to look at it, it's a case of it's the husband who left and went to find that person and was prepared to give that person money, and that person is there saying, I'm here to get my money and go pay for my child's school fees. So if you want me to render a service to you, by all means, I'm not going to ask of your marital status. I'm not going to ask of what happens, because this has got nothing to do with emotions. It's a transaction. I take what you can give, which is your money, and you take what you want, which is the sexual pleasure, and we part ways. So easy to point the finger where the other person is not going to push back. It's just that easy. And yet you find that these people with organized crime and these white collar crimes that are going on, it's all these high profile people, and it's just so easy to shift blame on that one person who is defenseless.
Do you feel that South Africa is ready to change the conversation, to change mindsets?
I think South Africa is ready, but it's so easy to go with the tide and just go with the flow. So because we're in such a minority and the marginalized group with the very little money, you find that it's easy for the masses to say you're wrong and how dare you stand up for yourself. We are an open-minded society, but we just need to
have more of these conversations.
As sex workers, we should stop talking to each other. It's high time that we started talking to the pastor. We started talking to the magistrate. We started talking to the doctors. We started occupying space and making our presence felt, just like the LGBTQIA community. I mean, in South Africa, we've legalized the use of marijuana. We've got hemp clothes. They even have oils now at pharmacies that are like openly available. And life is carrying on as per normal. Sex work has been there before these things, but still, it's always like, don't talk about it. It's always whisper. Until sex workers take up space and say, we are here and we are unashamed of it. Because sex work carries so much stigma and discrimination that when it's Sweat or Sisonke hosting sex workers, they're okay to come out and say, hi, here I am, I'm a sex worker. But if I were to invite you in that space and say, okay, here's Kate, she's a freelance journalist, you would find that people leave the room. They say, no, I don't want to be known. I want to be off camera. Like with me, I could do this. I could have this conversation with you on video because I am unashamed of being in the industry. I am unashamed of talking about it. I'm even comfortable walking around with a T-shirt written "Sex Work is Work." But for some people, it has had such a negative effect and such a traumatic effect that they would rather not talk about it. When someone is raped several times, that it has become a norm for them to be raped, and that they say, I'm not even going to lay a charge. It's happened to me for such a long time, but I just choose not to talk about it. So everyone suffers in silence. The same is happening in sex work.
And the worst part of it is when you cannot seek recourse. There's a case of Nokopila. That case is still resounding in my head. Nokopila was killed by a client, and the client said, what would I be doing with a filthy prostitute? Oh, and then she said, why would I kill her? And they said, how do you know that she's dead? How do you know that she was a sex worker? And that's when the pressures rose. And because there was Sweat and Sisonke behind everything, and everyone rallied behind Nokopila's death, that even the courts felt they had to do something about it. In most cases, not everyone is as lucky. I would term her as lucky as Nokopila, even though she had died. But at least justice was served. Whereas we know she is 1 in 100 or in 1,000 of sex workers who get killed at work.
Do we have a sense of how big the industry is?
The last study that was done, it was found that South Africa has more than 150,000 sex workers.
Okay.
But this number keeps growing each day. And now with COVID that has hit, I can tell you that the numbers have grown drastically. People that were working in professional places, and they are now suddenly approaching us and saying, how do I become a sex worker? Unfortunately, we cannot say this is how you become a sex worker, because then that will be termed as us coercing people into sex work. You can always become a Sisonke member, and that way we can only assist you in saying that these are your rights as a sex worker. These are the rights that you as a person need to know and start articulating.
should you be arrested, should a policeman approach you. That is the support that we can give as an organization. And it's also becoming of, as I would term it, as a support group, because sex workers have nowhere to gather and feel comfortable without being judged. And Sisonke and Sweat offers that. So we become that safe space where they can say, okay, I was raped, and we can say, okay, fine, let's approach now the justice system and seek recourse. That is the only kind of help we can give.
Is there anything else that you want to put on the table?
What I would like to say is that sex work is not an easy industry, because it has been long stereotyped. It's long been a taboo in our society, but it's there. And the more we talk about it, the better, because it raises awareness. And we find that a lot of children are getting lured into sex work, and we don't recognize children as sex workers, because, I mean, they have to be 18. Having parents actually encouraging their little girls and their little boys into the industry, I would like to harshly reprimand those parents for doing that, because you find that a lot of parents are now introducing their children into sex work, and that is very, very wrong. We do not encourage that. That is giving us a bad name, and it's giving us the stigma which we do not need. I mean, sex work can be a very beautiful industry if just everyone could just cooperate and do the right thing, and keep the children out of it. For real, I would never support any child who is into sex work. I wouldn't. But if they're 18 and above, that is the work they choose, so be it. But let us create a safe space for sex work and not blame sex workers for the injustices and the violence which they have to suffer at the hands of their clients. Hence we say, my work should not cost me my life.